Tom Weber on NPR News. We're hearing conversations on this show before the election with candidates for Congress in Minnesota. We did not get replies from every candidate, so not every race will be represented. In addition to me, you'll hear from NPR News political editor Mike Mulcahy hosting some of these conversations. Today, we're going to the 1st Congressional District, which is southern Minnesota. There's a lot of agriculture there. Also, the city of Rochester, which is now the 3rd largest city in Minnesota, after Minneapolis and St. Paul. Every county that borders Iowa is in the 1st District, along with the cities of Mankato, New Ulm, Winona, Albert Lea, and Worthington. DFL incumbent Tim Walz was first elected in 2006. He's seeking re-election and faces a challenge from Republican Jim Hagedorn. This is a rematch of the race 2 years ago, which Walz won. Hagedorn has a long career in government. He worked with the U.S. Treasury for many years, including the office that works with Congress on legislative matters. He was also a congressional aide, and his father, Tom Hagedorn, was a Minnesota congressman in the 70s and 80s. Congressman Tim Walz declined our invitation to appear, so in lieu of a debate, I am joined by Jim Hagedorn. Hello, thanks for your time.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Congressman Walz has been in Congress a decade. He touts his work as a bipartisan deal maker working across the aisle. What do you bring to the contest that's a compelling reason to drop Tim Walz and put you in Congress?
Well, there is a clear contrast. Congressman Walz has been out in Washington for 10 years, and he has no record of really solving anything. In fact, he's made things worse with his votes for Obamacare, for instance, and the skyrocketing debt. Things like expensive energy with cap and trade, and then, frankly, the vets are worse off today than when he went to Washington. And what I stand for are big, bold ideas along the lines of defending the country from extremists, supremacists in the Middle East, making sure our economy gets rolling with reforms across the board, regulatory reform, tax reform, U.S. energy independence. When it comes to veterans, I'm for letting the veterans choose their own doctors and hospitals. That's a big difference between the congressman and myself. And lastly, I want to protect our God-given rights, the right to life, the right to keep and bear arms, and the right to religious freedom, first and foremost.
Let me talk about farming as well, because that's a big issue in the 1st District. Minnesota Congressman Colin Peterson from the 7th District has suggested that if the farm economy remains as sluggish as it is, that Congress might have to address and look at passing a new farm bill starting next year, which would be ahead of schedule. That wouldn't necessarily be your decision if you're in Congress, whether that gets done ahead of schedule. But if it were to be, what should be in the next farm bill, I think to address this?
Yeah, I think what's being missed here are there two parts of agriculture that the government has an involvement with that can either help or hurt farmers. One is the ag programs, and I support the Farm Bill, and Congressman Walz and I are the same on that. The only difference is if I'm elected, I'll be in the majority in the House and be in a position of responsibility to get things done. But what's being lost is the federal government is doing a lot of things to hurt farming right now that they could change. And, I grew up on a farm. My father, grandfather, great-grandfather were all southern Minnesota farmers, and I get agriculture's up and agriculture's down. It's high capital, high risk, not always high reward. But what we don't get is why our congressman, who represents a rural district like the 1st, goes to Washington and votes to impose hardships and burdens on farmers with extremist EPA regulations, with things like the death tax, with high energy cost, with his cap and trade and carbon tax. And so I'm on the other side. I think what we want to do for farmers and agriculture in our rural communities is to have regulatory reform. Take the power from the EPA and give it back to the Congress so we don't have excessive regulation on our farmers.
What is it about whatever the EPA does that you disagree with is excessive? Give me an example of something the EPA does that is excessive for the farmers.
Well, it's doing quite a few things. When you look at what the EPA rules and what they're doing in energy, they're driving us out of coal. They're driving us into more expensive energy. Energy is very important for farming and agriculture. It's one of the most important line items. When you look at the Waters of the United States regulation, which is way over the top, and I don't think that should go into play unless the Congress of the United States would say that they affirm that rule. And so I think that they've gone too far. We should take the power away from the EPA, away from Obama's administration and other presidents, give it back to the Congress. Let the House and the Senate affirm major regulations. Also, Obamacare is a big problem for farmers. It's one of their largest line items now in their costs and expenses. It's really hurting agribusiness. It's hurting rural southern Minnesota. So Tim Walz, who voted for that, and myself, we have big differences on that issue.
And I'm going to come back to that in a moment on the health care costs, but we were also inviting, as we talked to Jim Hagedorn, who's the Republican nominee in the 1st District, southern Minnesota. DFL incumbent Tim Walz declined our invitation here. We were inviting questions through our Public Insight Network. And before I go to health care, Jim, this further question about agriculture gets to what you were just talking about. Regulation, frankly. Erica in Mankato asks, what suggestions do you have to support ag while helping to curb the increase in field tiling, which leads to more runoff in our watersheds and we're seeing more flooding in our cities? What would you say to that?
Well, again, I support what's called the RAINS Act. And the RAINS Act is a bill that the Republicans brought up many times that the congressman has voted against. You mentioned Cullen Peterson. He supports it. I support it. And it'll allow the Congress to affirm major regulations. As far as tiling is concerned, you can go too far. If we don't tile in southern Minnesota and be able to properly utilize our land, we're not going to have production farming as we have it today, and we're going to have much higher prices for food and less affluence in our rural communities. So that's where I stand on that.
The Minnesota River, as you know, though, has all the farm runoff that contributes to its low water quality, which I think is at least the goal or the spirit of some of those regulations that you criticize. So where's the happy medium? Where do you help rivers like the Minnesota River with all that farm runoff and also help farmers?
Well, when it comes to the waters of the United States regulation, I believe it's excessive and it goes too far, and it would allow the EPA to be in a position of power over agriculture, where they could move in and shut down farm operations and force farmers and agribusinesses to have to spend a lot of money to use their land. So I think it's just excessive. I don't believe that the Congress of the United States, when they passed the Clean Water Act many years ago, intended for the EPA to regulate in that way. And so I'm on the side of agriculture and the Farm Bureau, and I think most of the people in southern Minnesota.
On the healthcare note, rising costs, especially in the individual market, as you noted, that affects a lot of farmers. What would you do? What are your ideas on addressing healthcare costs? Is it a matter of, in your opinion, repealing Obamacare, or do you fix it? That's a big question on the campaign trail right now.
Well, we had a debate in Mankato recently, and my opponent said that, he voted for it, and that he voted against his district because Minnesota had a pretty good system, but he thought it was the right thing to do, and I thought that didn't make much sense. Look, I think it needs to be replaced. If it's going to be fixed, we're in the middle of a presidential campaign, and the Democrat candidate has not put out a fix, so I don't think that they know how to fix it or want to fix it.
Has the Republican candidate put out a fix?
Well, the Republican candidate has put out a very broad program. Now, here's where I stand. I think we should have competition across state lines in order to drive down costs. We should have expanded use of health savings accounts in order for people to be purchasing routine medical care. That way they'd be out there shopping. They'd also be rewarded for healthy living. We should have direct tax credits to people so they can take their benefits from job to job. We should have pools for people with pre-existing conditions, but make those pools separate from the quote-unquote healthy people so they don't drive up everyone else's costs. Minnesota had a pretty good system in place before Obamacare. This was unnecessary for the people of Minnesota. People with pre-existing conditions and others were covered. 93% of Minnesotans had health insurance before Obamacare. When Tim Walz voted for Obamacare, it was the worst vote he'll ever cast, and it's really hurt the people. It's more than this 4 or 5% in the individual market. If you talk to small business people, they're losing employees. People are having to change jobs for health insurance. You talk to medium-sized businesses, the price of health insurance for everyone in their business is going up. The care and coverage is inferior. There are people across southern Minnesota paying $20,000, $25,000 a year for health insurance premiums. With deductibles so high, the insurance is worthless. Meanwhile, my opponent, Tim Walz, said he would live under it just like everyone else, but he gets a 75% subsidy from the taxpayers. He pays about $500 a month with a $350 deductible, and frankly, that's not living under it just like everybody else.
As we watch the election play out, Jim, certainly the presidential race gets a lot of the attention, But it is worth noting, do you support Donald Trump, the Republican nominee? Do you plan to vote for him?
Well, I support the nominee, and I'm going to vote for Donald Trump, yes. And my opponent was a superdelegate for Hillary Clinton, so I suspect he's going to vote for her. The difference in the election is this, a big contrast. The country's going to either move further to the left, like we have been with President Obama, and we're going to have a Supreme Court stacked with radicals who will take away our basic rights, like the right to keep and bear arms. That's what's going to happen if Hillary Clinton wins. If Donald Trump wins, on the other side, he has big solutions on the border, big solutions on the economy, and he wants to have Supreme Court justices that are going to protect our basic rights. It's a clear contrast election. The country will move one way or the other. I hope it tacks back to what makes sense.
What consideration did you give the fact that you endorse him and plan to vote for him? What consideration did that get when this latest scandal came out with the video of him condoning sexual assault and the like with Billy Bush on that video? What did that video give you pause? What was your reaction there?
Well, I don't know how much. Let's put it this way. I'm not sure where my opponent was when the FBI came out and said that Hillary Clinton had committed effectively felonies, but they weren't going to prosecute her because they didn't think they could prove intent. Nobody asked him if he took a pause or he thought about that. As far as political correctness and those types of issues are concerned, look, that game is played from the 50-yard line down to the Republican goal line. The Democrats are the only ones that get the ball. They're on offense. The Republicans are, perpetually on defense. I think we are where we are. We're 3 weeks before an election. The country's either going to move left or it's going to tack back to what makes sense, in my view. We have people who are imperfect people, imperfect candidates, but they're vehicles that are either going to drive the country left or right. And so I'm for Mr. Trump in that regard.
Well, it's not an inconsiderate question, Jim, because other Republicans in Minnesota have said that video is now the reason they won't vote for it. The former governor, Tim Pawlenty, Kurt Doudt, the House Speaker, Eric Paulson, who's running for re-election himself. And you made the decision not to, or rather to continue. And so I'm trying to get a sense of what went through your mind when the video came out, because it did cause other Republicans in Minnesota to say, that's it, I'm done.
Well, they can speak for themselves. My consideration is that no one person is more important in the country, and the country is certainly more important than any one person. And we're either going to move left or we're going to move right. And I don't believe that our country can afford. We have serious problems that we're facing. We have a terrorist recruiting problem in Minnesota, for instance, and across this country. Which of the two candidates is going to do something about that? On refugees, I've called for a timeout. I think that's the way to go. My opponent has a pre-9/11 mindset of bring more of them in, and we'll keep adding to the problem. So there's a huge difference, for instance, between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, Tim Walz and Jim Hagedorn. And, after issue after issue after issue, if we focus on the issues, that's what we have to do for, as far as what's right for our country, in my view.
Why, of all the immigrants that come to the United States, of all the different populations, why are refugees, in your mind, the ones that need a timeout?
Well, that's just one proposal that I have out there. But the reason that I've called for a refugee resettlement timeout and the creation of safe zones in war-torn areas is to protect not just the refugees, but also the American people. And in the state of Minnesota, we have a terrorist recruiting problem from existing refugees under the existing system. So clearly the system is not working. And it wasn't Jim Hagedorn that came up with that analysis. That was Andrew Lugar, the U.S. attorney hired by President Obama's Justice Department, who made that assessment. And in the United States itself, we have 1,000 ongoing ISIS investigations, one in at least every state in the nation. This is a serious problem. We have a terrorist recruiting problem. We have a problem with Islamic terrorism in the United States, and I would rather start working on it and dealing with it rather than adding to the problem, like Congressman Walz, who's for open borders and more refugees.
Talking to Jim Hagedorn here, the Republican nominee for Congress in the 1st Congressional District, which is southern Minnesota. He's challenging DFL incumbent Tim Walz. Tim Walz declined our invitation. Final thought here from you, Jim. Is climate change real? And if so, how should we address it?
Well, the Earth has been heating and cooling ever since God created it, in my view. And there are lots of people that would say if it's real, then what's the next step? Should we spend trillions of dollars changing the way that we use energy, or should we maybe apply the monies in ways that would help people adapt? There's lots of debate on that. I'm a realist in this sense. The United States economy is in trouble. We're weak. One of the reasons we have low gas prices now is because there's no demand in our economy. But we need to become energy independent so we don't rely on foreign powers. We have to become energy independent so we can put downward pressure on the cost of energy, electricity, and things like that, because when we do, people have more money in their pockets to buy things and to live better lives. Businesses are more competitive, and the United States as a whole is more competitive versus people around the world, and we can attract back manufacturing. So I'm for an all-of-the-above approach on energy, oil, gas, coal, nuclear, renewables, conservation, you name it. And then to build the energy infrastructure that we need, the pipelines, the refineries, the distribution points, to efficiently use that energy. And if we do that, we can spur economic growth. We can start paying down the debt because there's a lot of U.S. energy in this country, and we can have high-wage jobs again.
Jim Hagedorn is the Republican nominee in the 1st Congressional District. Again, that's southern Minnesota, includes the city of Rochester, a lot of agricultural land as well. All of the counties that border Iowa are in the 1st Congressional District. You also have Mankato in there, and Winona, and Worthington, to name a few. Congressman Tim Walz, the DFL incumbent, declined our invitation. But Jim Hagedorn, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
We do have coverage of this race between Jim Hagedorn and Tim Walz on our website as well, some of the appearances they have made together and other issues being covered, so you can find those stories at nprnews.org.